Is Bitcoin overvalued? Let's discuss. So, hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about whether or not Bitcoin is currently over or undervalued. And looking at its recent price action, you might think, well, clearly Bitcoin was overvalued up here. How can we fall 12% in a matter of days if Bitcoin was undervalued? How could that happen? It must have been overvalued. Well, maybe, but there are other ways that we can look at this. So in talking about fair value for Bitcoin, is Bitcoin above its fair value or below its fair value? I want to talk about that in the context of what the dollar has been doing, the DXY, and that's this orange line here. So why the dollar? Why do we care about the dollar when it comes to Bitcoin's price? Well, if you've been around the space, you've probably heard that the DXY, which is basically the dollar's strength relative to a basket of other fiat currencies, that tends to be inversely correlated with what Bitcoin is doing. When the DXY is going down, Bitcoin tends to be going up. When the DXY is going up, Bitcoin oftentimes will be going down. We saw that very clearly here, 2022, where we had the DXY going parabolic, and then in 2022, Bitcoin falling off of a cliff. But then here in 2023, we saw the DXY was falling off a cliff, and then suddenly Bitcoin rallied again back to the upside. So we've seen this play out. And I'm not arguing that there's a direct causal relationship necessarily between the DXY and Bitcoin. What the DXY does do is it gives us a nice barometer of the market sentiment more broadly, broader market sentiment. The idea is that when a dollar is getting strong, that means that there's a lot of selling that's going on, likely of assets, into something safer like the dollar. When you see a lot of demand essentially for the dollar and it's strengthening its other currencies, that suggests that people are going into a risk-off mode. They're probably getting out of a lot of riskier assets, moving into the relative safety that the dollar, especially being the reserve currency, provides. Then vice versa, when you see the dollar really weakening, that means that there's a lessening of demand for the dollar. People are effectively selling the dollar and likely moving a lot of that value into riskier assets. And so this inverse correlation makes a lot of sense. And the dollar just tends to act as this nice gauge of what broader market sentiment is. And Bitcoin, being a risk asset, is going to be at the whim of whether or not the market is in a risk on or risk off type of sentiment. So that is useful to keep in mind. And more recently, when we were looking at what the dollar has been doing, we've been seeing this clear downtrend, which has been supporting the local uptrend that Bitcoin had been in really ever since the beginning of the year. And what we've been seeing is that with this trend line, this descending trend line here, the dollar is going back up and retesting that same level. And so based on seeing this, it's not super surprising that Bitcoin would be showing some weakness, given that the dollar was showing some strength. So thinking about this relationally is reasonable, but it doesn't give us any specific values. It doesn't really tell us what is the actual fair value of Bitcoin. All it's saying is that, generally speaking, when the dollar is going up, that might mean that that's going to be acting as a headwind for Bitcoin. When it's going down, that might be acting as a tailwind. What I want to talk about next is actually a model that I put together that can help us to identify what the fair value of Bitcoin might be based on what the DXY is doing. So this is actually a model that I had shown in advance to our Polarity Digital Pro subscribers over at our website, polaritydigital.io. If you want to become a subscriber, go over to the website, again, polaritydigital.io. You can sign up there. Link is in the description. And this was the model that I'd shown up in advance, and I think it's a very useful model, so I wanted to talk about it quickly here as well. So the red line is the model. So this is this DXY-based fair value model. And you see it does a pretty good job, especially in oftentimes leading the way. You see, for example, here in 2020, it leading to the way to the upside, and then price moving up to it. Then conversely, towards the end of 2021 and going into 2022, it led the way down, and then price came down to meet it as well. And then importantly, going up through here into the beginning of the year, it led the way up, and now price has been going up here. So oftentimes the fair value, as denoted by what the DXY has been doing, can give you advanced idea of where the market might be heading, or at least if the market is overvalued or undervalued, and then if it's likely to go back and meet its fair value, which it oftentimes will do. It can get dissociated from the fair value for a while, it can get dislodged, but then given enough time, it will find its way back to the fair value over time. So this is a model that's fit to all the data. We can also just fit it to some of the data and see how well it holds up in out of training data sample. So for example, here what I did is I trained it on all the data that existed up until the beginning of 2018. So the training data would be this data, and this is all test data. This is all data that the model knew nothing about when it was being fit. And you can see it does a very good job. And so this would suggest that this is not an overfit model, that even when you only train it on data up until 2018, the beginning of 2018, it still leads the way in 2020, leads the way down in 2022, and leads the way up in 2023. And still a useful model just being fit back here. And so that might suggest that the relations that the model is picking up between the DXY and Bitcoin back through here are relatively stable and still predictive of what Bitcoin's price is likely to do based on the DXY going into the future. Now, the version of the model that I think is maybe more useful to look at is one that I'm calling the real-time fit of the model. This is just basically using all the data you have up until some given day to fit the model. And it's basically just using all the data available to you to fit the model at each day. And so that's what this is showing you, is basically the value here is just the fit of the model and its predicted Bitcoin fair value price based on all the data before it, but knowing nothing about the data that comes after it. And so you can see a similar fit to what we saw with when we fit it to all the data, also not too different from when we fit it only up to data here up till 2018. And what I wanted to talk about here at the end then, to kind of get back to what we were talking about before with the fair value of Bitcoin currently, is what things are looking at like more currently with this real-time fit. So here I'm going to zoom in on data just from 2020 on through to today. So that's what we're looking at over here. And so you can see that in the beginning of the year, in 2023, we were sitting all the way down here after getting flushed out in the FTX crash, way down here, you know, down this 15, 16, 17K range. Meanwhile, the fair value for Bitcoin, based on what the DXY was doing, because remember, the DXY was falling off a cliff at around this point, it was pointing to much higher prices for Bitcoin. And then sure enough, Bitcoin started to move up closer to that fair value general range. And this currently, it's in the mid 35Ks is where this is pointing right now, but it was getting up, depending on what the DXY was doing, up to around 40K, and the 40Ks up through here. And that's where we currently stand. And so if we look at this and we ask the question, is Bitcoin overvalued? From this perspective of this model, the answer is no. That currently is still undervalued based on what the DXY has been doing, based on the weakness the DXY has been showing. So even though it's closed the gap to some degree, the gap between here and here is smaller now than it was back over here, it still is undervalued. And so you might still think that it's reasonable to expect that price could find its way back to the fair value. Now, this is assuming that the DXY stays relatively weak or still continues to trend down. If we see the DXY break decisively to the upside, you might actually see this fair value start to fall, and maybe you'll have price meet the fair value in that way. But if we continue to see the DXY moving down, as it has been, we actually might think that if Bitcoin is going to refine its way to its fair value, you'd actually expect the price, in this case the white line, to find its way up to the fair value line. So we're going to have to wait and see how that all plays out. But that's something I wanted to mention right now, is the state of affairs right now is that based on the DXY, Bitcoin still seems to be relatively undervalued. Now, obviously, that's not financial advice. You should make your own opinions about what you think is going to happen, make your own evaluations of these data, etc. You know, your money is your own. I'm not telling you what to do. But this is, I think, a useful piece of data to consider, to think about. And so as I was just mentioning then, the thing that I'm going to be looking at really closely here is what happens with the DXY relative to example with this trend line. Does it actually continue to get rejected? You'll notice that as I'm recording this on the 23rd of August, we had this threat of a breakout on the DXY above this trend line and then up into this resistance zone over here. And if that had continued, that would have been that bearish stance. That probably would have seen the DXY fair value for Bitcoin fall, and then there wouldn't necessarily be that indication as clearly that Bitcoin's undervalued. But if we see this rejection continue, and in the coming days we see the DXY start to move down and continue this downward trend that we've seen of setting in lower highs and lower lows, then I expect the fair value relative to Bitcoin to at least stay consistent at where it was in that mid 30K to around 40K region. And then you might expect Bitcoin's price could go up to meet that fair value up at those levels. So it's going to be something that's interesting to watch. But I did just want to make this video because I think a lot of people got quite scared with this recent sell-off that we saw, and saw that as a confirmation that Bitcoin must have been getting overextended up here, overvalued, and that the only plausible direction for it to continue in is to go down, and maybe even way down. On Twitter, I was seeing some pretty extreme predictions, notifications from different people saying that Bitcoin was going to set in new lows relative to the November 2022 lows, that it was going to go down to 10K or even lower, that this was the beginning of an epic collapse for Bitcoin down to levels that we haven't seen in years. I still think it's well too early to be making that bearish of a call. I'm not saying that that's impossible, but I'm certainly saying that it's too early to know that. And I, for one, would like to see the data support that before I get too far into that type of thing. And so as long as we're seeing the weakness in the dollar, I'm personally not in the camp that thinks that that is the most likely scenario. It's a possible scenario, but I'm not going to sit here and personally think that it's the most likely one. All right, I hope you like the content. Again, if you want to join us at our Polarity Digital Pro subscription service, you can do so at our website, polaritydigital.io. Link is in the description. And of course, give the channel a subscription if you haven't already. And you can follow us on Twitter, where we put a lot of updates about our indicators, models, and more over there.